Good morning, history classes. It is Thursday, April 16th, and we're going to be getting into the two sort of landmark civil rights pieces of legislation from the mid 1940s. This is the 1960s, not 1940s, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So we've been talking a little bit about some of the social upheaval and violence that had been taking place beginning in the early 1960s concerning the civil rights movement and the efforts to gain full civil and voting rights for African Americans. So beginning in 1963, we have John F. Kennedy is the president, and he's going to be finally kind of shaken into supporting the civil rights movement a little bit more than he would have been politically really given to doing. Remember, at this point in time, the Democratic Party, of which Kennedy was a member, was kind of divided at this point between Northern Democrats who were a little bit more progressive on race issues and Southern Democrats who were traditionally Democratic because Lincoln, who had defeated the South in the Civil War, was a Republican. And so they didn't want to be Republicans because Lincoln had been. So you have the Northern Democrats who are a little bit better, a little bit more progressive on race, and then the Southern Democrats who are not at all progressive on race. And Kennedy is wary politically of taking too much of a stand in favor of African American civil rights because he doesn't want to tick off the Southern regressive racially wing of his party. That's a good way to lose a lot of support in the South politically, even if you're doing morally the right thing. So 1963, this is a couple months before his assassination. Kennedy's going to come out in favor of civil rights finally. In addition to the conflict in Birmingham, civil rights protests were taking place in cities from Jackson, Mississippi to Cambridge, Maryland. President Kennedy became convinced that he had to take a more active role in promoting civil rights. This is kind of that there's an old French saying about social leaders. When they see the people that they're supposedly leading going off and kind of taking the lead role in things, the leader says, "Oh, there go my people. I must catch up to them so that I can lead them." This is kind of what Kennedy's doing. He sees the writing on the wall. He sees the way things are going, says, "Okay, president needs to be a little bit more out front on this, so I'm going to finally take a little bit more of a leadership role." On June 11th, 1963, Kennedy delivered a moving televised address calling civil rights a moral issue. He declared that the nation had an obligation to fulfill its promise of giving all Americans equal rights and equal opportunities. President Kennedy sent to Congress a proposal for sweeping civil rights legislation. His brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, led the charge for passage of the bill. Again, this is a few months before John Kennedy is assassinated, and Robert Kennedy, or Bobby Kennedy, is one of the leaders who was assassinated then in 1968 when he was running for the presidency. But this is 5 years away from Bobby Kennedy being killed. Okay, to put pressure on Congress to pass the new civil rights bill, supporters made plans for a massive demonstration in Washington, D.C. The event brought together the major civil rights groups, including the NAACP, the SCLC, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the SNCC, as well as labor unions and religious groups. This is going to be the March on Washington. This is the huge march where we see Dr. King giving the I Have a Dream speech, kind of the iconic video that I'm sure you all seen. The March on Washington took place on August 28, 1963. Organizers had hoped for 100,000 demonstrators, but more than double that number showed up, having made the journey to the Capitol from around the country. Before the march, there had been some concern about maintaining order at such a huge demonstration. Yet, despite the massive numbers, the day was peaceful and even festive. Popular celebrities and entertainers were on hand to perform for the crowd. Bear in mind, this is an event kind of headlining and being very much led by Dr. King, whose goal is nonviolent civil disobedience. So it's not really surprising that this, gathering of 200,000 people in Washington, D.C. could remain civil and peaceful. The main rally took place in front of the Lincoln Memorial, where a distinguished roster of speakers addressed the crowd. The highlight of the day came when Martin Luther King Jr. took the podium. King held the audience spellbound as he described his dream of a colorblind society when all God's children would be free and equal. Millions more watched King's address live on television. This powerful and eloquent speech has come to be known as the I Have a Dream speech, and we're going to spend some more time reading that as an original source next week. Behind the scenes, there was some tension between the organizations that had planned the march. SNCC, in particular, had wanted to stage a more militant protest to show its dissatisfaction with the pace of change. Yet, for the public at large and for most who took part, the March on Washington represented a magical moment in American history. So then, following this enormous protest, 200,000 people is a whole lot of people, especially in a place as small as the mall in Washington. A month later, things start to take a little bit more violent turn. On September 15th, 1963, less than 3 weeks after the march, a bomb exploded in the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. The church had been the SCLC's headquarters earlier that spring. 4 young African-American girls, all dressed in their Sunday best, were killed in the bombing. This act of violence, this killing of these 4 girls through a church bombing, still has a huge amount of resonance in the South. People very much remember that. This is one of the real turning points in the battle for civil rights. Then 2 months later, on November 22nd, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency. Now, Johnson is a Southern Democrat. He's from Texas. He's a Southerner. He's a Democrat. It's not unreasonable to expect him to not be really great on civil rights, but he's going to come out and be surprising to people. Johnson was a Southerner with an undistinguished record on racial matters. However, he surprised many Americans by immediately throwing his support behind the cause of civil rights. No eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory, Johnson told Congress and the nation, than the earliest passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long. The Civil Rights Bill faced strong opposition in Congress, but Johnson put his considerable political skills to work for its passage. Lyndon Johnson was a past master of congressional arm twisting. He had been a very powerful member of Congress for a very long time before he became John Kennedy's vice president, and really knew how to get people to do what he wanted them to do, either through cajoling and promising, making promises, or through veiled threats. He was a pretty tough politician, and he threw that ability behind the passage of the Civil Rights Act. The bill passed in the House of Representatives, but it faced a more difficult fight in the Senate, where a group of Southern senators, big surprise, attempted to block it by means of a filibuster. This is a tactic by which senators give long speeches to hold up legislative business. Filibusters are weird. You can get up, and as long as you don't stop talking at any point or sit down, you can talk for days on end, or basically as long as you are able to stand. You can stand and read cookbooks, and people have done that before. And the point of a filibuster is to keep the Senate from voting on something that you don't want them to vote on. So I stand up and read War and Peace or read the Bible cover to cover. And as long as you don't sit down or have to go to the bathroom or anything like that, you can hold the floor and keep the Senate from voting. Let's see, the filibuster went on for more than 80 days until supporters finally put together enough votes to overcome it. In the end, the measure passed in the Senate, and President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law in July. And here's what the law did. The act banned segregation in public accommodations and gave the federal government the ability to compel state and local school boards to desegregate their schools. Remember, with Brown versus Board of Education, there hadn't been really any enforcement powers given to anyone in order to make sure that states and school boards actually desegregated their schools. Now, with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that's going to happen. The act also allowed the Justice Department to prosecute individuals who violated people's civil rights and outlawed discrimination in employment on account of race, color, sex, or national origin. It also established the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, which is still around, the EEOC, which is responsible for enforcing these provisions and investigating charges of job discrimination. Okay. Like I say, we're going to spend more time next week on MLK and the I Have a Dream speech. The next big push is going to be for voting rights. Remember that the African American men, at least by 1865, had been given the right to vote via constitutional amendment. But in practice, particularly in the South, that right was denied to most African Americans. And of course, African American women weren't even given the right to vote till much later in law. So with the next big push, we're going to have the Voting Rights Act, which is going to be necessary to actually make sure that African Americans get to vote. Okay. All right. The SNCC had spent several years organizing voter education projects in Mississippi. It met with little success and a great deal of violent opposition. But in 1964, it called for a major campaign known as Freedom Summer. About 1,000 volunteers, mostly black and white students, were to flood Mississippi. This is a lot of college kids, primarily coming down from the north, New York, Massachusetts, wherever, flooding into the South in order to do the work of helping African American Southerners actually register to vote and then be able to go and cast ballots. They would focus on registering African Americans to vote. They would also form the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, an alternative to the state's all-white regular Democratic Party. Even before most of the volunteers had arrived, 3 civil rights workers, Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman, disappeared. SNCC claimed that they were murdered. State authorities denied those charges. President Johnson ordered a massive search for the 3, which ended when their bodies were found buried in an earthen dam. All had been shot at point-blank range. Yet, despite the obvious dangers, almost all of the other volunteers remained in the state. So these 3 men, Michael Schwerner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman, 2 white men from the north and 1 African-American man from the south, had been in Mississippi working to register African-American voters. They turned out were abducted by a group of white men, which, if memory serves, included the local sheriff or police chief or something. They were taken out and murdered and buried in a dam. This was the kind of violence that voting rights initiatives pretty regularly faced in the South in the 1960s. After Freedom Summer ended in August 1964, an MFDP delegation traveled to the Democratic Convention in New Jersey, seeking to be recognized as Mississippi's only Democratic Party. At the convention, Fannie Lou Hamer, one of the MFDP's leaders, gave powerful testimony. She described how she and other activists had been beaten, fired from their jobs, and displaced from their homes, all because, as she put it, they wanted to register and live as decent human beings. In other words, exercise their civil rights as Americans. Despite Hamer's testimony, the Democrats refused to seat the MFDP. Instead, party officials offered a compromise. They would seat 2 MFDP members as at-large delegates and reform the nomination rules to guarantee greater minority representation in the future. The MFDP rejected the offer. Ironically, Mississippi's regular Democratic delegation left the convention in protest because the National Party had made the offer to the MFDP. Remember, rank-and-file Democrats in the South at this time were not progressive on race. Okay, that is a change that's going to come later after the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts propel kind of traditional Southern Democrats who were Democrats because they didn't want to be associated with Lincoln get fed up with Democratic Party support for civil rights and then move to the Republican Party. This is a decades-long process of this movement, but that's why the South is largely Republican now instead of Democratic. Early in 1965, Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC organized a major campaign in Selma, Alabama, to pressure the federal government to enact voting rights legislation. The protests climaxed in a series of confrontation on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on the main route from Selma to Montgomery. I was listening to a podcast that talked a lot about this yesterday. And I've driven through Selma before, and the Edmund Pettus Bridge is still there. It's this iconic thing. I'll try to remember to put some pictures of these things in our notes for today before I send them to Mr. Schmidt to upload to the site. But the attack on the Pettus Bridge in Selma, that's where John Lewis, who is still the United States representative from the Atlanta area, was nearly killed. His skull was fractured. He was beaten so badly by state police. But this was a peaceful movement, people trying to march from Selma all the way to Birmingham, I believe. No, Montgomery, the state capital. And this was, again, televised around the world. This is still photos and video of African-American marchers being savagely beaten, being tear gassed. And this is going to draw, this is the goal of nonviolent civil disobedience, is to draw worldwide attention to injustice where it is happening. And, in the hope and in the belief that that attention will prompt leaders to change their ways. And in fact, that's what happens eventually. The first of these confrontations took place on March 7th, 1965, a day that became known as Bloody Sunday. Heavily armed state troopers and other authorities attacked the marchers as they tried to cross the bridge. Okay. See, television coverage of the violence outraged the nation. On March 15th, President Johnson went on national television and called for a strong federal voting rights law. Historically, regulation of voting rights had been left to the states, but Johnson argued that it is wrong to deny any of your fellow citizens the right to vote, and this is what was happening on a state-by-state basis. Other states, the North and the West, might be more liberal with allowing African Americans to vote, but almost uniformly through the South, there were insurmountable barriers put up against the voting rights of African Americans. He added, "Their cause is our cause too, because it is not just Negroes, but really it is all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice, and we shall overcome." Spurred by the actions of protesters and the words of the president, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The act banned literacy tests and empowered the federal government to oversee voting registration and elections in states that had discriminated against minorities. In 1975, Congress extended coverage to Hispanic voters in the Southwest. Okay, so these are going to be two huge pieces of legislation that they're going to come directly from. You can draw a line straight from the nonviolent protests beginning in the 1950s of African Americans and their allies in the South, and the passage of these huge pieces of legislation that are still very relevant now. They're still on the books today, even though a couple of years ago the Voting Rights Act took a hit and has been scaled back in ways that are, to my mind, pretty unfortunate. But so we're seeing now at this point in the mid-1960s this realization of a lot of the goals of the nonviolent protest of the civil rights movement. Obviously, these are not going to go far enough. The civil rights movement has years to go after this before what we think of as its end. And of course, the United States is not by any means a racially just society now. But 1964, the Civil Rights Act, 1965, the Voting Rights Act, is going to be two huge pieces of legislation pushed through by Lyndon Johnson. Again, kind of surprising that he did this, given that he was a Southern Democrat from Texas. But without him, they probably would not have happened. These measures would have kind of died on the vine. So anyway, I'll get the notes uploaded or sent to Mr. Schmidt anyway, and hopefully he'll get those uploaded shortly. And I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.